Imagine you are driving home on a road you have traveled hundreds of times. Traffic is light. Your hands move almost automatically. You recognize the turn before consciously thinking about it. A car suddenly begins drifting into your lane. Before you can describe what is happening, your foot moves toward the brake. Now imagine that someone asks you a different question. A notebook and a pen cost $1.10 together. The notebook costs $1 more than the pen. How much does the pen cost? An answer may appear immediately, 10 cents. It feels obvious, and it is wrong. If the pen cost 10 cents, the notebook would cost $1.10, making the total $1.20. The correct answer is 5 cents. Something interesting has happened. In the first situation, rapid thinking may have protected you from a collision. In the second, rapid thinking confidently produced an error. That tension lies at the heart of Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. The book is an exploration of human judgment built around a useful metaphor. Our minds operate through two broad modes of thought. One is fast, intuitive, automatic, associative, and emotionally responsive. The other is slower, more deliberate, effortful, analytical, and capable of following rules. Kahneman calls them System 1 and System 2. They are not literal regions of the brain, and they should not be imagined as two miniature people living inside the mind. They are conceptual characters, a way of organizing different kinds of mental activity. System 1 is what allows you to recognize an angry face almost instantly. It helps you complete the phrase, bread and. It notices that one object is farther away than another. It detects the emotional tone of someone's voice. It reads familiar words without deliberate effort. It makes quick judgments about whether a situation feels safe. System 2 becomes more active when you calculate 17 times 24, compare two complicated insurance plans, inspect an argument for logical flaws, or deliberately search your memory for the name of someone you met 3 years ago. The contrast seems simple, but the implications are enormous. Much of human life is governed by impressions that arrive before reasoning begins. We do not first analyze the world and then experience intuition. Usually an interpretation appears. Only afterward do we decide whether to inspect it. This means deliberate thought often starts from material produced by automatic thought, and that material can be excellent or deeply misleading. Consider a simple situation. You meet a new coworker named Elena. During your first conversation, Elena remembers everyone's names, speaks confidently, makes a clever joke, and offers an elegant solution to a problem. Within minutes, you begin forming a broader impression. She seems competent, maybe organized, probably reliable, perhaps even leadership material. Notice how quickly the mind moves from a small amount of evidence to a coherent picture of a person. You have observed a few behaviors. Your mind constructs a character. This is useful. Human beings cannot suspend judgment forever. Social life would be impossible if every interaction required weeks of formal investigation before we formed expectations. But the same ability creates predictable errors. Suppose Elena is brilliant in conversation, but terrible at completing projects. Suppose she is charming, but chronically late. Suppose the impressive solution she offered happened to involve her one area of expertise. Your first impression may still color how you interpret everything that follows. If Elena later misses a deadline, you may call it an unusual mistake. If someone you disliked on first meeting misses the same deadline, you may call it evidence of irresponsibility. The mind likes coherence. Once a story forms, new information is often interpreted through it. This is one of the broad themes in Kahneman's work. The mind is not merely a machine for receiving evidence. It is a machine for constructing plausible stories from limited evidence. And plausibility is not the same as probability. Imagine that you are told about a man named Marcus. Marcus loves poetry, collects old records, dislikes large parties, and spends weekends visiting museums. Now you are asked which is more likely. Marcus is a librarian, or Marcus is a salesperson. Many people feel pulled toward librarian. The description fits the stereotype. But what if there are 20 times more salespeople than librarians in the population you are considering? Suddenly the problem changes. A description that resembles a stereotype may feel more informative than the underlying statistics. This is the tension between representativeness and base rates. Our intuitive mind asks, what does Marcus seem like? A probabilistic analysis asks, how common are the possibilities to begin with? Those are not the same question. And one of Kahneman's enduring insights is that the mind often answers an easier question when confronted with a harder one. This substitution happens constantly. You ask yourself, how happy am I with my life? That is difficult. Your mind may quietly substitute, how do I feel right now? You ask, how competent is this political candidate? Your mind may substitute, how confident does this person sound? You ask, how dangerous is flying? Your mind may substitute, how easily can I imagine a plane crash? You ask, how valuable is this company? Your mind may substitute, how exciting is its story? The easier question generates an immediate answer. Then we may mistake that answer for a response to the original question. This mechanism helps explain many cognitive biases. Take the availability heuristic. Imagine two people who live in similar neighborhoods. One watches several dramatic news reports about burglaries. The other does not. Nothing about their actual neighborhoods has changed. Yet the first person may suddenly estimate burglary as much more likely. Why? Because examples are easier to retrieve from memory. Events that are vivid, recent, emotional, or repeated become mentally available, and mental availability can masquerade as statistical frequency. This is why one frightening story can dominate 100 quiet facts. If a friend tells you about a terrible reaction to a medication, that story may influence you more strongly than population-level evidence. If you recently heard about two startups becoming billion-dollar companies, entrepreneurship may feel more predictably lucrative than it really is. If three people in your social circle recently divorced, you may temporarily feel that marriages everywhere are collapsing. The mind is not literally calculating how many examples can I retrieve. But ease of retrieval affects the feeling of likelihood. That feeling often arrives without revealing its source. This last point is important. We experience the conclusion. We usually do not experience the hidden machinery that produced it. Suppose you interview two candidates for a job. The first is interviewed at 9 in the morning when you are rested. The conversation flows. The second is interviewed at 5:30 after a stressful day. You are tired, hungry, and distracted by an unfinished problem. The second candidate somehow feels less impressive. You may generate reasons. Their answers seemed less energetic. Their examples lacked precision. The cultural fit felt uncertain. Perhaps those judgments are correct, but perhaps your internal state contributed more than you realize. The dangerous feature of bias is not merely that irrelevant influences exist. It is that the mind is extremely good at explaining its conclusions after they appear. We are storytellers about our own judgments, and the story often sounds more rational than the process that generated it. Now consider anchoring. Imagine you are negotiating the price of a used dining table. Before you see it, the seller says they originally hoped to get $1,000. You inspect the table and know that $1,000 is too high. You reject the number. But now imagine a second buyer sees the same table after the seller casually mentions that they were hoping for $400. Even if both buyers believe they are independently estimating value, their final offers may differ. The initial number can act as an anchor. Once a number is introduced, judgments may adjust away from it insufficiently. Anchoring is especially strange because even arbitrary numbers can influence estimates. The effect is not that people blindly accept the first number they hear. It is subtler. The anchor changes the mental neighborhood in which subsequent reasoning happens. Suppose you are asked whether the tallest redwood tree in a certain region is taller or shorter than 1,000 feet. You know 1,000 feet sounds absurd. Then you are asked to estimate the actual height. Compare that with someone first asked whether the tree is taller or shorter than 100 feet. The two estimates may shift in the direction of the initial number. Why would a ridiculous number matter? Because thinking is not performed in a vacuum. Once attention is drawn toward a particular scale, related possibilities become more mentally accessible. This has practical importance in negotiation, pricing, forecasting, and everyday conversation. The first plausible figure can shape the territory. Another major idea in thinking fast and slow is the framing effect. Suppose a doctor explains a surgical procedure in one of two ways. Version 1, 90% of patients survive the first year. Version 2, 10% of patients die within the first year. These statements communicate equivalent numerical information, yet they do not necessarily feel equivalent. Survival directs attention toward success. Mortality directs attention toward loss. The emotional framing changes the psychological experience of the choice. This reveals something uncomfortable. Our preferences are not always sitting inside us like stable objects waiting to be measured. Sometimes the way a choice is described partly creates the preference we express. Consider shopping. A store advertises beef as 90% lean. Another label says 10% fat. Same product, different mental image. A subscription service says you can save $20 per month. Another presentation says failing to switch will cost you $240 per year. Again, the arithmetic can describe the same difference, but loss and gain are psychologically different categories. This brings us to one of the most influential parts of Kahneman's work with Amos Tversky, prospect theory. Classical economic models often imagine decision makers evaluating outcomes primarily according to their final level of wealth. Prospect theory proposed something psychologically richer. People often evaluate outcomes relative to a reference point. Changes matter, gains matter, losses matter, and losses frequently have a stronger psychological impact than equivalent gains. Imagine finding $50 on the sidewalk in the morning. You feel pleased. Later that afternoon, you discover that you lost $50 somewhere. Financially, you are back where you began. Psychologically, however, the day may not feel neutral. The loss can dominate the gain. Now imagine receiving a $5,000 bonus at work. You are delighted. Then you learn that colleagues in similar positions receive $7,000. The objective gain is still $5,000, but your reference point has changed. What initially felt like a gain may begin to feel like a loss. This is crucial because people do not experience outcomes in isolation. We experience them relative to expectations, comparisons, previous conditions, and imagined alternatives. A person earning $100,000 may feel wealthy after previously earning $60,000. Another person earning the same amount may feel deprived after previously earning $150,000. The number is identical. The psychological reference point differs. This helps explain why human satisfaction can be so unstable. Improvements quickly become normal. Expectations move. Yesterday's luxury becomes today's baseline. And once something becomes part of the reference point, losing it can feel disproportionately painful. Loss aversion also influences risk-taking. Suppose you have the choice between receiving $900 for certain or taking a gamble with a high probability of receiving $1,000 and some chance of receiving nothing. Many people prefer certainty. Now imagine you have already lost money and must choose between accepting a definite additional loss or gambling for a chance to avoid the loss entirely, with a risk of losing even more. People may become more willing to gamble. Why? Because the psychological response to gains and losses is asymmetric. When protecting gains, people may become cautious. When trying to escape losses, they may become risk-seeking. This pattern can appear in investing. An investor buys a stock for $100. It falls to $70. Selling feels like making the loss real. So the investor holds, not because new evidence indicates the company is attractive at $70, but because accepting the loss is painful. Meanwhile, a profitable investment may be sold too early because locking in a gain feels satisfying. The reference point can influence behavior more than a fresh evaluation of future prospects. But loss aversion should not be treated as a universal law explaining every choice. Human behavior depends on context, stakes, experience, framing, individual differences, and the structure of the decision. Later research has refined debates about when and how strongly losses loom larger than gains. The broader lesson remains useful. Our reactions often depend less on absolute outcomes than on changes relative to expectations. This emphasis on reference points connects with another powerful concept: adaptation. Imagine moving into a much larger apartment. For the first few weeks, everything feels spacious. You notice the sunlight. You appreciate the kitchen. You tell friends how different life feels. 6 months later, you walk into the same apartment without thinking about any of it. The improvement has become the background. The mind is highly responsive to change, but less responsive to states that remain constant. This is one reason humans can underestimate adaptation when predicting future happiness. We imagine a major improvement and mentally focus on that improvement. A promotion, a new house, a move to a better climate, a relationship, a purchase. We forget that the future will also contain grocery shopping, bad sleep, email, traffic, laundry, family tension, taxes, boredom, and ordinary Tuesday afternoons. The imagined future becomes narrower than the lived future. This is closely related to what Kahneman calls the focusing illusion. When attention is concentrated on one factor, that factor can appear more important than it will actually be in the full experience of life. Suppose you live in a cold city and fantasize about moving somewhere warm. You imagine beaches, sunlight, outdoor dinners, and blue skies. The climate becomes psychologically enormous because you are thinking about climate. But a person who already lives there is not spending every hour thinking about weather. They are thinking about work, relationships, bills, health, deadlines, and what to make for dinner. The feature that dominates imagination may become only one element of experience. This produces a broader warning. What we attend to feels important, and because attention is limited, whatever occupies it can temporarily crowd out everything else. This is why news cycles can make one issue seem like the only issue, why an argument can make a relationship feel entirely bad, why one failure can make an entire career feel unsuccessful, why one physical insecurity can dominate a person's perception of their appearance. Attention is not merely a spotlight. It can become a temporary theory of reality. Now consider confidence. Suppose a manager has interviewed dozens of candidates over the years. The manager says, "I can tell within 5 minutes who will succeed here." That confidence might come from genuine expertise, or it might come from the mind's ability to construct coherent impressions rapidly. How can we tell the difference? Kahneman's answer is surprisingly balanced. Intuition is not inherently foolish. Under the right conditions, intuition can be extremely sophisticated. An experienced firefighter may sense danger before being able to explain exactly what changed. A skilled nurse may notice that a patient doesn't look right before clear symptoms appear. A chess master can glance at a board and immediately recognize meaningful patterns. An experienced driver reacts to subtle movements in traffic without consciously calculating trajectories. These intuitions can be genuine forms of expertise, but expertise requires an environment with enough regularity to learn from and enough feedback to correct mistakes. This distinction is essential. Imagine two professionals. One is an experienced weather forecaster making short-range predictions based on repeated patterns, measurable variables, and frequent feedback. The other predicts which technology company will dominate an unpredictable industry 15 years from now. Both may sound confident, but the environments are fundamentally different. In one, patterns may be stable enough for learning. In the other, outcomes depend on countless interacting forces, including competitors, regulation, inventions, economic shocks, leadership changes, and luck. Experience alone does not guarantee valid intuition. You can spend 20 years making judgments in a noisy environment without learning much if feedback is delayed, ambiguous, or misleading. This is one of the most valuable ways to think about intuition. Do not ask merely, "Is this person experienced?" Ask, "Is this an environment in which experience can reliably teach the right lessons?" Imagine a doctor who sees hundreds of cases of a disease with clear diagnostic patterns and receives rapid confirmation from tests. That environment can train intuition. Now imagine a manager selecting employees. The manager hires someone. Years later, the employee succeeds or fails. But success depends on training, team quality, changing responsibilities, economic conditions, personality fit, luck, and opportunities. The feedback is muddy. The manager may still feel that experience has made them highly intuitive, but the learning environment may not support such confidence. This is where Kahneman's analysis becomes more than a collection of amusing mental mistakes. It becomes a theory of when human judgment deserves trust. Intuition is strongest when three conditions roughly hold. There are patterns to learn. Those patterns repeat often enough, and feedback arrives clearly enough to improve future judgment. Without those conditions, confidence can grow faster than accuracy. This explains why experts can be both astonishing and disappointing. A professional can have superb intuition within a narrow domain and terrible intuition outside it. A brilliant surgeon may be no better than anyone else at predicting stock prices. A successful entrepreneur may understand their own industry while being wildly overconfident about politics. A skilled investor in one market may mistake past success for a general ability to forecast uncertain systems. Expertise is usually local. Confidence is more portable. That mismatch causes trouble. Kahneman also examines overconfidence through what he calls the illusion of validity. Imagine a hiring committee interviewing candidates. One candidate is polished, articulate, and charismatic. Everyone leaves the room feeling certain that the candidate will perform well. The evidence forms a coherent story. Confidence rises, but confidence often reflects coherence more than predictive accuracy. A story can be beautifully coherent and still be built on weak evidence. This connects with one of Kahneman's memorable ideas. What you see is all there is. The mind tends to construct the best story it can from information currently available. It does not automatically represent missing evidence with the seriousness missing evidence deserves. Imagine someone tells you, Rachel is intelligent, hardworking, confident, and... Before hearing the rest, you already have an impression. Suppose the missing words are cruel and dishonest. Your initial story changes dramatically. The problem is not that you consciously decided missing information did not matter. The problem is that the mind began building coherence immediately. We are good at making sense of what is present. We are much less naturally sensitive to what is absent. This matters whenever evidence is incomplete. Consider online reviews. You see 20 passionate complaints about a product. The complaints are vivid, but how many satisfied customers never wrote anything? You do not know. The available information tells a compelling story because the unavailable information is psychologically silent. Or consider a successful founder who explains how they built a company. They describe boldness, persistence, rapid decisions, and refusal to listen to doubters. The story is inspiring. But how many failed founders behaved exactly the same way? They are absent from the room. This is survivorship bias. We observe survivors and build theories from them without fully accounting for invisible failures. The same problem appears in investment advice. A successful trader explains the principles behind a spectacular year. Perhaps the principles mattered. Perhaps luck mattered. Probably both mattered. But once the outcome is known, randomness becomes difficult to see. Human beings are uncomfortable with luck. Stories are easier. This creates hindsight bias. After an event happens, the path toward it can begin to look more predictable than it actually was. Imagine a small company launches a product that unexpectedly becomes a global hit. Afterward, articles explain why success was inevitable. The design was perfect. The timing was ideal. The founders understood culture. The marketing strategy was brilliant. Some of these explanations may be true. But before launch, many other products with apparently promising characteristics may also have looked capable of success. The outcome reorganizes our memory of uncertainty. Once we know what happened, alternatives fade. History begins looking cleaner than the future ever looked while people were living through it. This creates a dangerous lesson. If we underestimate the uncertainty of past events, we overestimate our ability to predict future ones. Imagine watching a football game after someone tells you the final score. Early decisions made by the winning coach start to look strategic. A risky play that succeeded seems courageous. If the same play had failed, it might have been called reckless. Outcome knowledge changes interpretation. The same thing happens in business. A CEO takes a major risk. If the company thrives, the decision becomes visionary. If the company collapses, the decision becomes irresponsible. But the quality of a decision and the quality of its outcome are not identical. A sensible decision can produce a bad outcome because of bad luck. A foolish decision can produce a good outcome because of good luck. This distinction is extremely important for improving judgment. If you evaluate decisions only by results, you cannot learn accurately. Imagine choosing to carry an umbrella because the forecast predicts heavy rain. The day remains dry. Was carrying the umbrella a bad decision? Not necessarily. The decision should be evaluated using the information available at the time, not knowledge that became available afterward. Similarly, imagine driving after drinking heavily and arriving home safely. The good outcome does not make the decision wise. Judgment improves when we separate process from outcome. That is difficult because outcomes are emotionally powerful. Success makes decisions look intelligent. Failure makes them look foolish. The mind wants a moral. Reality often offers probability. Another famous topic in the book is regression toward the mean. Suppose a basketball player has an extraordinary game and scores far above their usual average. Fans expect another spectacular performance. Instead, the next game is ordinary. They search for an explanation. Maybe the player became overconfident. Maybe the defense adapted. Maybe pressure increased. Any of these could be true. But there is a simpler possibility. Exceptional performances often contain both skill and favorable randomness. When randomness becomes less favorable, performance naturally moves closer to the person's typical level. The same pattern happens after unusually bad performances. A salesperson has a disastrous month. The manager gives a harsh lecture. The next month is better. The manager concludes that harsh criticism works. But if the disastrous month was partly an extreme fluctuation, improvement may have happened even without the lecture. Now imagine the reverse. An employee has an unusually excellent month. The manager praises them warmly. Next month is less impressive. The manager concludes that praise causes complacency. Again, regression toward average performance may be doing much of the work. This is a profound source of false causal stories. Whenever something unusually good or bad happens, what follows is often less extreme. The mind wants to explain the change, so it invents causes. This can lead teachers, coaches, managers, investors, doctors, and parents to learn the wrong lessons from experience. Imagine a child receives an unusually low grade. A parent imposes strict punishment. The next grade improves. Punishment appears effective, but perhaps the low grade was partly caused by an unusually difficult test, poor sleep, or random variation. Without comparison, we cannot know. Humans are built to see causes. Statistics often tells us that some variation requires no dramatic story. This conflict between causal thinking and statistical thinking appears throughout Kahneman's work. Causal stories are intuitive. Statistics requires deliberate effort. If a restaurant is unusually crowded tonight, you want to know why. Maybe a concert ended nearby. Maybe a famous critic recommended it. Maybe a holiday is approaching. Sometimes there's a reason, but random variation also exists. Not every fluctuation has a meaningful cause. The mind dislikes that answer because randomness does not make a satisfying story. Now consider another subtle bias, the planning fallacy. Imagine you decide to renovate your kitchen. You estimate 6 weeks. Why? You picture the necessary sequence, remove the old cabinets, install new ones, replace counters, paint, finish. Your estimate comes from what Kahneman calls the inside view. You focus on the details of your particular project. But a better question might be external. How long do projects like this usually take? Perhaps similar renovations routinely require 12 weeks. The outside view uses a reference class. Instead of asking only, how will my project unfold? It asks, what normally happens in projects of this kind? This sounds obvious, yet people repeatedly ignore base rates when planning. Writers underestimate how long books will take. Software teams underestimate development time. Homeowners underestimate renovation costs. Governments underestimate infrastructure budgets. Students underestimate assignments. People planning weddings underestimate complications. Why? Because the future is imagined as a clean sequence of intended actions. Unexpected events are difficult to picture in detail. The electrician is unavailable. A shipment arrives late. Someone gets sick. A bug creates 3 additional bugs. A key employee leaves. Requirements change. A document needs revision. No single disruption is guaranteed. But some disruption is often highly predictable. The irony is that unexpected events are individually unpredictable, but collectively normal. A realistic plan does not need to know which problem will occur. It needs to remember that problems occur. This is one of the most practical lessons from Thinking Fast and Slow. When forecasting, do not rely exclusively on the story of your own case. Find comparable cases. Ask what usually happens. This can feel unsatisfying because your situation feels unique. And in some ways it is. But uniqueness is often exaggerated. Imagine a student writing a thesis. They estimate completion in 3 months. Their project has unique intellectual content, but the delays that affect these may be highly ordinary. Revisions, data problems, advisor feedback, fatigue, competing responsibilities. The content is unique. The process may not be. The outside view is a defense against the seductive specificity of our own plans. But there is a deeper challenge. Knowing about biases does not make them disappear. This may be the most sobering message in Kahneman's work. You can understand anchoring and still be anchored. You can understand the availability heuristic and still be influenced by vivid examples. You can understand overconfidence while remaining overconfident. You can teach the planning fallacy and still underestimate your next project. Why? Because these biases are not usually mistakes caused by ignorance alone. They emerge from normal mechanisms of cognition. Fast thinking is not a defective system waiting to be educated away. It is the default architecture that allows us to function. You cannot deliberately calculate every interpretation. You cannot statistically analyze every face. You cannot consciously inspect every sentence you hear. You cannot run formal probability models before crossing the street. Most of the time, automatic thinking is not only useful, it is necessary. The challenge is therefore not to replace intuition with analysis. That would be impossible and undesirable. The challenge is to recognize situations where intuition deserves supervision. This is harder than it sounds. System 2 is effortful. Deliberate thinking requires attention. Attention is limited. When people are tired, distracted, emotionally activated, hurried, or overloaded, careful reasoning becomes less likely. Consider a familiar experience. You are trying to eat more deliberately. After a calm morning, resisting a snack is easy. After 8 hours of stressful work, poor sleep, an argument, and a difficult commute, the same choice feels different. It would be simplistic to interpret the second moment as revealing your true character. Cognitive resources vary. Human judgment is state-dependent. This does not mean the mind contains a simple battery that becomes empty in a perfectly predictable way. Some early psychological claims about willpower as a single depletable resource became controversial, and later research raised serious questions about strong versions of that idea. But the broader point remains sensible. Attention, motivation, fatigue, emotion, and context influence the quality of deliberate thinking. We cannot assume our reasoning ability is constant across situations. This brings us to an important issue in reading Thinking, Fast and Slow today. The book was enormously influential, but not every empirical finding associated with its intellectual era has aged equally well. Psychology underwent a major replication crisis after many famous findings proved difficult to reproduce reliably. Some studies involving social priming became especially controversial. Social priming refers to the idea that subtle exposure to certain concepts can unconsciously influence later behavior in surprising ways. For example, one widely discussed line of research suggested that exposing people to words associated with old age could make them walk more slowly afterward. Results like these became famous because they seemed to reveal a hidden mind continuously shaped by subtle cues. But later attempts often failed to reproduce some of the strongest social priming effects. That does not mean priming as an entire concept is imaginary. In cognitive psychology, many forms of priming are well established. Seeing or processing one stimulus can influence how quickly related information is processed afterward. What became controversial were some of the more dramatic claims that subtle conceptual cues could reliably produce complex social behavior. The distinction matters. It would be a mistake to conclude psychology discovered that priming is fake. It would also be a mistake to continue treating every famous priming experiment as secure evidence. Scientific knowledge changes through refinement. Some effects survive, some shrink, some depend heavily on context, some disappear. Some turn out to have been exaggerated by small samples, publication bias, flexible analysis, or chance. Kahneman himself took replication concerns seriously. That response is consistent with the spirit of the book at its best. Human beings become attached to coherent stories. Scientists are human beings too. A beautiful result can become a compelling story. A field can build confidence around that story. Later evidence can reveal that the original confidence was too strong. The lesson is not that psychology is worthless. The lesson is almost Kahnemanian. Confidence should reflect the quality and quantity of evidence, not merely how compelling a narrative feels. Another example concerns the so-called hot hand in basketball. Earlier research had famously argued that people's belief in streaks of successful shots was largely an illusion. Fans believed players became hot, but statistical analysis appeared to show that success was not meaningfully more likely after previous success. This became a classic example of people seeing patterns in randomness. Later statistical work identified important problems in how some earlier analyses were conducted. Evidence emerged that hot hand effects can exist, even if they are often smaller or more complicated than fans imagine. This is fascinating because it reverses the usual story. Researchers studying cognitive bias can themselves be affected by methodological limitations. The claim, people irrationally see streaks, was intellectually attractive, but later work suggested reality was more nuanced. This should change how we read behavioral science. The goal is not to collect a catalog of biases and then diagnose everyone around us. That quickly becomes another form of overconfidence. You learn the confirmation bias, and suddenly every disagreement becomes evidence that the other person is biased. You learn the availability heuristic and notice it everywhere except in yourself. You learn about overconfidence and become extremely confident in your ability to identify other people's overconfidence. The more useful attitude is epistemic humility. Your mind is capable of systematic error. So is mine. So are experts. So are institutions. So are scientists. The answer is not permanent skepticism. It is better calibration. Calibration means matching confidence to evidence. Imagine a weather forecaster who says there is a 70% chance of rain on many different days. If rain occurs on roughly 70% of those days over time, the forecaster is well calibrated. Now imagine someone who repeatedly says they are 90% sure, but turns out to be correct only 60% of the time. Their confidence exceeds their accuracy. Human beings are often poorly calibrated, especially in uncertain domains. We like certainty. Language itself encourages it. This will happen. That company will fail. She is definitely lying. This strategy always works. He will never change. The world often offers probabilities. We convert them into declarations. Improving judgment may therefore begin with changing how we think about certainty. Instead of asking, "Am I right?" ask, "How confident should I be?" Instead of, "Will this happen?" ask, "What probability would I assign?" Instead of, "Is this person competent?" ask, "What evidence do I have, and what important evidence is missing?" Instead of, "Why did this happen?" ask, "How much of my explanation is known, and how much is a plausible story?" These questions create mental friction. That friction can be valuable, but it cannot be applied to everything. If you attempted to quantify uncertainty before every trivial decision, life would become impossible. The trick is identifying high-value moments. When the decision is important, when the outcome is difficult to reverse, when strong emotion is present, when incentives might distort judgment, when you are predicting an uncertain future, when a number may be serving as an anchor, when a vivid story is competing with statistical evidence, when your confidence is high, but the evidence is thin, when everyone in a group agrees too quickly, when the cost of error is substantial. Those are moments when slow thinking earns its expense. Imagine you are hiring someone for an important role. An intuitive process might involve a free-flowing conversation. You like one candidate immediately. The conversation feels natural. You discover shared interests. Confidence grows. A more disciplined process could separate dimensions: technical competence, relevant experience, communication, reliability, problem solving. Each dimension gets evaluated independently using the same questions for every candidate. Scores are recorded before the group discusses overall impressions. This does not eliminate bias, but it reduces the opportunity for one strong impression to contaminate every judgment. If you love the candidate's personality, you may unconsciously rate their technical answers more generously. Structured evaluation creates barriers between impressions. This illustrates a broader principle. Because individuals cannot simply switch off bias, better judgment often requires procedures. Checklists, reference classes, independent estimates, pre-mortems, structured interviews, decision journals, statistical models, delayed evaluation. These tools can outperform good intentions because they change the process around judgment. Consider a pre-mortem. A team is preparing to launch a project. Everyone is excited. Instead of asking, what might go wrong? The leader says, imagine it is 1 year from now. The project failed badly. Write down the most likely reasons. This small change can release information that optimism and group pressure might otherwise suppress. A quiet team member may think the schedule is unrealistic. Someone else may know that a supplier is unreliable. Another person may suspect customers do not actually want the feature being built. In ordinary discussion, raising these concerns can feel negative. In a pre-mortem, identifying risks becomes the assignment. The procedure changes the social incentives. This is important because many judgment errors are not purely individual. Groups create their own distortions. Imagine a meeting where the senior executive speaks first. I think the acquisition is an excellent opportunity. Now everyone else begins speaking. Even if nobody consciously changes their opinion, the anchor has been set. People know what the leader prefers. Ambiguous evidence may now be interpreted in that direction. A better procedure might gather independent judgments before discussion. This preserves information that would otherwise disappear into conformity. Slow thinking is therefore not simply a private mental act. It can be institutional design. Build systems that make errors easier to detect. This matters because asking individuals to be less biased is often unrealistic. Imagine a pilot. We would not improve aviation safety merely by telling pilots to concentrate harder. Aviation relies on procedures, instruments, training, cross-checks, standardized communication, and redundancy. The system assumes human beings can make mistakes. That assumption is not insulting. It is protective. Good decision-making systems do something similar. They do not require perfect thinkers. They anticipate imperfect thinking. There is a paradox here. Kahneman spent much of his career studying flaws in human judgment. Yet the reasonable conclusion is not that intuition should be distrusted everywhere. If anything, the book teaches discrimination. Some situations are friendly to intuition. Others are hostile. Imagine choosing what to cook for dinner. You probably do not need a spreadsheet. Imagine choosing a retirement investment involving most of your savings. Now deliberate analysis is more valuable. Imagine a tennis player returning a serve. Slow calculation would be disastrous. Imagine a doctor deciding whether a rare symptom indicates a serious disease. Intuition may generate hypotheses, but base rates and diagnostic evidence matter. The skill is not becoming permanently slow. It is knowing when speed is dangerous. This is why the title Thinking Fast and Slow can be slightly misleading if interpreted as a moral contrast. Fast does not mean bad. Slow does not mean good. Fast thinking is efficient, creative, fluent, socially intelligent, and often remarkably accurate. Slow thinking can be lazy, misinformed, motivated, and capable of constructing elaborate arguments for conclusions that intuition already preferred. Deliberation does not guarantee truth. A clever person can rationalize almost anything. Suppose you strongly want to buy an expensive car. Your intuitive desire appears first, then deliberate thought gets to work. The car is safer. The financing is reasonable. You will keep it for many years. The resale value is strong. You work hard and deserve it. Perhaps all of this is true, but System 2 is not always an impartial judge. Sometimes it behaves like a lawyer hired by System 1. It constructs arguments for a verdict already reached. This is why intelligence does not make people immune to bias. In some situations, intelligence can make rationalization more sophisticated. The ability to generate reasons is not the same as the willingness to revise beliefs. Improved judgment requires something more difficult. You must sometimes use your intelligence against your preferred conclusion. Ask what would change your mind. Search for evidence that could prove you wrong. Imagine the opposite outcome. Consult people who do not share your incentives. Compare predictions with actual results. This is uncomfortable because beliefs are not only propositions. They can be connected to identity, status, loyalty, and emotion. If you identify strongly with a political group, information about that group is not processed like neutral information about the temperature. If you have invested 5 years in a business idea, evidence against it threatens more than the business. It threatens the meaning of 5 years. If you publicly predicted an outcome, Changing your mind may feel like losing status. Judgment becomes harder when accuracy competes with identity. This helps explain confirmation bias. Suppose you believe a certain diet is uniquely effective. You notice friends who lose weight on it. You remember testimonials. You share success stories. When someone fails, you think they probably followed the diet incorrectly. Evidence supporting the belief feels diagnostic. Evidence against it gets explained away. The mind does not always search neutrally. It often asks, can I believe this? When information is desirable, and must I believe this? When information is uncomfortable. These different standards can preserve almost any worldview. The solution is not to become emotionally empty. Humans cannot detach identity from every belief, but we can design situations in which disagreement becomes less threatening. Treat beliefs as forecasts. Reward updating. Distinguish confidence from loyalty. Ask people to identify what evidence would change their view before the outcome is known. These practices make belief revision less humiliating. One of the deepest themes in Kahneman's work is that people are less internally consistent than they imagine. We like to think we have stable preferences, yet framing alters choice. Reference points alter satisfaction. Recent events alter risk perception. Anchors alter estimates. Mood alters judgment. The sequence of experiences alters memory. Context changes what comes to mind. Does that mean there is no stable self? No. But it means the self is partly constructed in interaction with circumstances. Consider the difference between experiencing a moment and remembering it. Kahneman draws a distinction between the experiencing self and the remembering self. The experiencing self lives through each moment. The remembering self later constructs a story about the experience. Those two perspectives can disagree. Imagine two vacations. Vacation A lasts 4 days. Every day is wonderful. Vacation B lasts 7 days. The first 5 days are wonderful, the sixth is average, and the final day is stressful because of travel problems. Which vacation contained more total pleasant experience? Probably vacation B. Which one might be remembered more fondly? Possibly vacation A. Memory does not simply add every moment equally. Certain moments, especially peaks and endings, can disproportionately shape the story we retain. This creates strange consequences. A longer pleasant experience can be remembered less positively if it ends badly. A painful experience can sometimes be remembered more favorably if discomfort decreases before the end, even if total discomfort lasts longer. The exact strength and generality of these effects vary across contexts, and they should not be transformed into universal laws. But the larger distinction is philosophically important. A life is experienced moment by moment. A life is also remembered as a narrative. Those are different forms of value. Suppose you attend a concert. For 90 minutes, you are completely absorbed. During the final song, someone nearby starts a loud argument. Later, you say, that ruined the whole concert. Did it? It may have ruined the memory of the ending. But it did not travel backward in time and erase the 90 good minutes you already experienced. The remembering self compresses duration into a story. Stories are useful, but they can distort total experience. This raises difficult questions about happiness. Should we maximize pleasant moments, meaningful memories, life satisfaction, achievement, purpose, relationships? No single psychological measure captures everything humans care about. And this is another point where we should resist turning Kahneman's framework into a simple life optimization manual. Human value is richer than measurable utility. Sometimes we voluntarily choose difficult experiences because they matter. Training for a marathon may contain discomfort. Raising children contains exhaustion. Learning an instrument contains frustration. Caring for a sick parent can be painful and meaningful at the same time. A good life cannot be reduced to maximizing momentary pleasure. But understanding the difference between experience and memory can still improve choices. You may notice, for example, that you spend enormous resources creating photographable memories while neglecting ordinary daily experience. Or the reverse. Perhaps your daily routine is comfortable, but leaves you with little sense of growth or meaning. The tension is real. There is no formula that resolves it. Thinking fast and slow is strongest when it makes these tensions visible. It is weaker when readers turn its concepts into a complete map of the mind. The System 1 and System 2 distinction is a metaphor. Useful metaphors organize complexity. They also simplify it. Real cognition involves interacting processes distributed across perception, memory, emotion, attention, learning, motivation, and neural systems. There is no literal System 1 sitting somewhere in your skull making intuitive decisions, while System 2 waits in another room with a calculator. The model is valuable because it helps us reason about differences between automatic and controlled cognition. The danger is reification, treating the metaphor as a physical fact. Similarly, cognitive biases are not necessarily separate bugs stored independently in the mind. Many emerge from overlapping mechanisms: limited attention, associative memory, pattern recognition, emotional salience, reference dependence, sampling errors, story construction, social incentives, uncertainty. The catalog of biases can become overwhelming because new labels multiply. But the deeper structure is simpler. The mind must make decisions quickly using incomplete information. To do that, it uses shortcuts. Those shortcuts are often useful. Under certain conditions, they produce predictable errors. The interesting question is not, how irrational are humans? It is, why would a system that usually works produce this particular error here? Take stereotyping. It is morally dangerous when generalized beliefs about groups are applied carelessly to individuals. But the underlying cognitive mechanism, categorization, is unavoidable. You recognize chairs despite never seeing exactly the same chair twice. You recognize dogs across enormous variation. You form expectations about restaurants, airports, offices, and social situations. Categories let the mind predict efficiently. The problem arises when a coarse category is treated as more informative than individual evidence, or when a stereotype becomes resistant to contradictory evidence, or when social prejudice determines which categories are learned in the first place. Again, fast thinking is not a villain. A necessary cognitive tool can become unreliable when used beyond its proper domain. This perspective is more constructive than simply calling people irrational. Human beings are bounded reasoners. We have limited time, limited information, limited attention, limited memory. We use methods that are good enough often enough. The remarkable fact is not that these methods fail. It is that they work as well as they do. You can walk into a crowded room, identify a friend, interpret facial expressions, understand speech, navigate obstacles, remember why you came, and respond appropriately, all within seconds. No conscious calculation could manage that. Intuition is one of the mind's greatest achievements. Its danger comes from opacity. When an intuition appears, it does not arrive with a reliability score. The feeling "I know" can accompany genuine expertise. It can also accompany stereotype, emotion, familiarity, or wishful thinking. Subjectively, those experiences can feel similar. That is why confidence is such an unreliable guide to accuracy. The practical question becomes, how can we know when to trust ourselves? A realistic answer begins with domain knowledge. If you have extensive experience in a stable environment and have received clear feedback, intuition deserves more respect. If the environment is highly unpredictable, confidence should fall. If your judgment depends on a small sample, confidence should fall. If you have strong personal incentives, confidence should fall. If the outcome is emotionally important, confidence should fall. If you are making a long-range prediction in a complex system, confidence should fall substantially. Notice what this does not require. It does not require you to become a machine. It requires adjusting confidence, not eliminating judgment. Suppose you are choosing a restaurant. You have eaten there 15 times and enjoyed it 14 times. Trust your intuition. Suppose someone asks whether the restaurant will still exist 10 years from now. Now your confidence should be much lower. Same restaurant, different question. The structure of uncertainty changed. Realistic improvement in judgment is therefore less glamorous than eliminating bias. You will not become perfectly rational. You will not memorize a list of cognitive errors and suddenly see reality without distortion. You cannot inspect every intuition before acting, and trying to do so might make you indecisive. Improvement is more like installing guardrails around predictable danger zones. For important forecasts, write the prediction down, include a probability. Later, compare the prediction with reality. This exposes overconfidence. For large projects, find a reference class. Ask how long similar projects actually took. This counters the planning fallacy. For hiring, Use structured criteria before discussing overall impressions. This reduces halo effects. For group decisions, collect independent judgments before people influence one another. This limits social anchoring. For major investments, write down why you are buying and what evidence would make you sell. This helps prevent hindsight from rewriting your original reasoning. For emotionally charged decisions, introduce time. Not because slow thinking is automatically correct, but because strong affect can temporarily dominate attention. For complicated numerical questions, use tools. A calculator does not feel insulted when your intuition is wrong. For medical or financial probabilities, pay attention to base rates. For predictions about uncertain environments, use ranges rather than single numbers. These are not heroic intellectual achievements. That is precisely why they work. They move good judgment out of the realm of personal brilliance and into procedure. There is another powerful improvement. Ask better questions. Suppose your company is considering a new product. The enthusiastic question is, how big could this become? That question directs attention toward upside. Ask another, what percentage of products like this fail? Now the base rate enters. Ask another, what assumptions must be true for our forecast to work? Now hidden dependencies become visible. Ask another, if a competitor presented this plan, what weaknesses would we notice? Now distance changes perspective. Ask another, what evidence would make us stop? Now future sunk cost problems are addressed before emotions intensify. Questions structure attention, and attention shapes judgment. This may be one of the most useful implications of Kahneman's work. You do not always need a better answer. Sometimes you need a better question. Imagine an argument with someone you love. Your mind asks, why are they being so unreasonable? Once that question is active, evidence organizes itself around unreasonable behavior. Try another. What might they be seeing that I am not? The answer may still be that they are wrong, but the search space changes. Or imagine receiving criticism at work. The immediate question is, how do I defend myself? Try, which part of this criticism would be useful if I heard it from someone I trusted? Again, the conclusion may not change, but attention has been redirected. Good judgment often depends on creating room for evidence that fast thinking would otherwise ignore. There is humility in this. The goal is not to distrust every thought. That would be another kind of error. The goal is to develop a relationship with your own mind in which confidence is not confused with certainty. You can think, this seems right, while still leaving conceptual space for, and I could be wrong. That sentence sounds trivial. It is psychologically difficult. Human beings want closure. Uncertainty is uncomfortable. Certainty allows action. Groups reward confidence. Leaders are often expected to sound sure. Experts are frequently punished for saying the evidence is mixed. Media environments compress probability into prediction. Will the market rise or fall? Will the candidate win or lose? Will the technology succeed or fail? Reality answers with distributions. We demand categories. A better thinker learns to tolerate some unresolved probability, not infinite hesitation, calibrated uncertainty. Suppose an analyst says, I think this project has a 65% chance of succeeding. Someone else says, so you think it will succeed. Not exactly. A 65% probability includes a substantial chance of failure. If failure occurs, that does not automatically mean the forecast was foolish. Probabilistic thinking changes the relationship between prediction and surprise. It allows uncertainty to remain visible. This is particularly important because humans often confuse low probability with impossibility. A 1 in 10 event feels unlikely. If it happens, people may conclude someone must have made an error. But 1 in 10 events happen. If you make enough forecasts, unlikely outcomes become inevitable somewhere. This matters in medicine, investing, politics, business, and ordinary life. You can make a good decision and lose. You can make a bad decision and win. Probability separates wisdom from fortune. That separation can make us kinder judges of ourselves and others. Not permissive, more accurate. A founder who launches a reasonable business and fails is not necessarily incompetent. An investor who makes money on a reckless gamble is not necessarily skilled. A doctor can follow best practice and still face a tragic outcome. A person can make careful choices and still experience bad luck. Outcome bias tempts us to turn every result into a verdict on the decision maker. Probabilistic thinking resists that temptation. There is something deeply human in Kahneman's project. We want to believe the mind sees the world directly, but we do not simply see. We interpret, we predict, we remember selectively, we substitute questions, we construct stories, we compare outcomes with reference points, we react to frames, we learn from feedback, sometimes well and sometimes badly. We experience confidence without seeing where it came from, and then we call the final product reality. Understanding this can initially feel destabilizing. If my mind is vulnerable to all these biases, how can I trust anything? But that is the wrong conclusion. The existence of visual illusions does not make vision useless. If two lines appear different lengths because of surrounding shapes, we do not close our eyes forever. We learn that perception can be systematically distorted under certain conditions. Cognitive biases should be treated similarly. They are not proof that thought is hopeless. They are maps of situations where thought requires correction. The mature response is neither naive trust nor total distrust. It is conditional trust. Trust intuition where learning conditions support it. Verify intuition where errors are costly. Use statistics where stories can mislead. Use stories where human meaning matters, but do not confuse narrative coherence with evidence. Use experience, but ask what kind of feedback experience provided. Use confidence, but calibrate it. Use models, but remember they simplify. Use scientific findings, but allow them to change when better evidence appears. This last principle deserves emphasis. Thinking fast and slow emerged from decades of extraordinary research, much of which remains foundational in behavioral economics and cognitive psychology. Its core ideas about heuristics, framing, reference dependence, overconfidence, anchoring, base rate neglect, and the difference between intuitive and deliberate thought profoundly influenced how people understand decision-making. But the book also reflects the scientific literature available when it was written. Some findings celebrated during that period later received weaker support. Social priming is the clearest example. Other claims were refined rather than discarded. The hot hand debate changed when later analyses challenged earlier statistical assumptions. Broader psychological research became more cautious about small studies, dramatic effects, and results that appeared only under narrow experimental conditions. This does not diminish the book's central intellectual achievement. It improves how we should read it. The deepest lesson is not, here is the final catalog of human irrationality. It is, human judgment is fallible, including scientific judgment, so confidence should remain answerable to evidence. That principle applies to the book itself. There is a beautiful symmetry in that. A book teaching us not to trust compelling stories too easily should itself be read without turning its stories into unquestionable doctrine. A book about overconfidence should make us cautious about becoming overconfident in cognitive bias vocabulary. A book about incomplete evidence should remind us that psychology continues accumulating evidence after publication. A book about updating beliefs should be read as an invitation to update. And perhaps this is where realistic intellectual improvement begins, not with becoming a perfectly rational person. There is no such person. Not with suppressing intuition. You would lose creativity, speed, social perception, expertise, and much of ordinary functioning. Not with analyzing everything. You do not have the time or cognitive capacity. Instead, improvement means learning the geography of your own uncertainty. Where does your intuition have genuine training? Where are you merely confident? Which judgments are easy to reverse? Which deserve careful inspection? Where are base rates available? Where are you being anchored? What information is missing? What story are you telling because the story is satisfying? What would you have believed before knowing the outcome? What prediction are you making that you can later test? What would someone with different incentives notice? Those questions do not guarantee wisdom. They create conditions in which wisdom becomes more likely. Return to the road we began with. A car moves suddenly into your lane. You do not want to calculate probabilities. You want the fast mind. You want recognition before language. You want your body to respond. But later, suppose you are deciding whether driving is safer than flying, whether a dramatic accident means an entire form of transportation is dangerous, or whether a vivid story should change your behavior. Now intuition may need help. The same mind that can save you in 1 second can mislead you in the next. That is not a contradiction. It is the nature of a system designed to operate in a world too complex for continuous calculation. Fast thinking gives us impressions. Slow thinking sometimes examines them. Experience trains some intuitions and leaves others unreliable. Emotion tells us what matters, but can distort how much it matters. Stories help us understand life, but can hide randomness. Confidence helps us act, but can exceed knowledge. Memory gives continuity to experience, but rewrites the past. None of these mechanisms is simply good or bad. They are tools shaped by evolution, learning, culture, and circumstance. The real skill is knowing their limits. Perhaps better judgment does not feel like suddenly becoming smarter. It may feel more modest. A little less certainty where certainty is not justified. A little more patience before making an irreversible choice. A willingness to ask for the base rate. A habit of separating outcomes from decisions. A readiness to test intuition rather than worship it. A willingness to say, I don't know, without treating ignorance as defeat. And enough humility to remember that knowing the names of biases does not move you outside human psychology. You are still inside the system you are trying to understand. That may be the most important insight of all. The mind studying cognitive bias is itself a biased mind. The mind trying to correct overconfidence can become overconfident about its corrections. The mind learning to distrust stories immediately creates a new story about being the kind of person who cannot be fooled. There is no final escape from this. There is only better practice, better questions, better feedback, better procedures, better calibration, and a slightly wider gap between the first thought that arrives and the certainty we attach to it. In that gap, slow thinking has a chance to enter, not to rule every moment, not to defeat intuition, but to ask when the stakes deserve it. What else might be true?